On the morning of July 30th, 2026, a Spanish city of 84,000 people absorbed roughly 60,000 arrivals in under 2 days. The figure came from Juan Jesus Vivas, president of Ceuta's regional government. It amounts to about 7 people arriving for every 10 already living there. Almost none came through the border post. They swam around a breakwater that runs out into the Mediterranean at Tarajal beach, on the only land frontier the European Union shares with Africa. By Friday evening, the Spanish government confirmed at least 57 dead. Reuters footage from Thursday showed young men climbing out of the water onto coastal roads, and families with small children moving behind them. Some carried inner tubes. Others had sealed their phones inside waterproof pouches before entering the sea. On the Moroccan side, security forces deployed water cannon trucks. Near the crossing stood the charred shell of a bus and 7 burned cars. Many of the dead drowned. Others died in a crush at the breakwater fence, according to a local Civil Guard Workers Association. Pedro Sanchez flew in on Friday. He called the crossings a violation of Spanish territorial sovereignty and promised to defend the city, in his words, as if it were Madrid. Spain's Interior Ministry said 25,000 people were returned to Morocco that day alone. Ursula von der Leyen called the images unacceptable. France ordered immediate reinforcement of its Spanish border and activated rapid intervention units. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz welcomed Spain's refusal to move arrivals onto the European mainland. Giorgia Meloni threatened to suspend Schengen with Spain, a step Josep Borrell publicly noted no member state can take unilaterally. Strip away the emergency and a pattern appears underneath it. February 2014, 14 people died at that same beach. May 2021, 8,000 entered Ceuta in 48 hours. June 2022, at least 23 died at the fence around Melilla, Spain's other African city. Each episode produced statements, an investigation, and a return to routine. Each one happened along the same short stretch of water, under the same set of rules. Something about that water makes it worth this much attention, this much money, and this many funerals. It is not the widest sea crossing into Europe. It is not the deadliest. It is, however, the only place where the European Union touches Africa on land, which turns a geographic accident into a permanent negotiation. So begin where the negotiation begins, with the map. At its narrowest, the Strait of Gibraltar measures about 14 kilometers. The tightest line runs between Point Marroquí on the Spanish side and Point Cires in Morocco. And depending on the measurement you take, it closes to roughly 13. On a clear day, people standing on the beach at Tarifa can see the Rif Mountains. 2 continents, 2 currency zones, and a 10-fold difference in income sit inside a distance an amateur swimmer can see across. The water itself does not cooperate. Atlantic surface water pours east into the Mediterranean, while denser, saltier Mediterranean water slides west underneath it. And that exchange produces currents that push small craft sideways with no warning. Layered on top is one of the busiest shipping corridors on Earth, where container vessels and tankers move continuously through a channel narrower than most metropolitan bays. A person in an inflatable dinghy sits below the horizon line of a ship's bridge. Ceuta changes the geometry entirely. The city occupies a peninsula on the African coast, wrapped by Moroccan territory, with a border fence that continues into the sea as a breakwater. From the Moroccan town of Fnidek, the swim to Spanish ground runs about 5 kilometers along the shoreline. From Belunech, on the other side of the peninsula, the distance is shorter still. Nobody needs a boat, a smuggler, or an engine. They need an inner tube and a few hours of darkness. That is the fact that separates this corridor from every other route into Europe. Crossing the central Mediterranean from Libya requires a vessel, a crew, and thousands of dollars paid in advance. Crossing to Ceuta requires a decision. Meanwhile, the legal version of the same journey takes about an hour. The fast ferry from Tarifa to Tangier runs several times a day, year-round, for the price of a restaurant meal. The barrier has never been the water. It is the document you present at the terminal, which means the border is not the fence and not the water. It is an expectation held by tens of thousands of people at once about what happens after they arrive. Governments on both sides spend enormous effort managing that expectation because the physical barrier has never been the binding constraint. Understanding why so many people are willing to test it requires looking at the economics on the southern shore. Morocco is not a failed state, and it is not a war zone. Its economy grew 4.7% in 2025, according to the World Bank, faster than the previous year and faster than Spain. Casablanca has a functioning stock exchange. Tangier has an automotive cluster that exports to Europe, and the country runs one of the largest solar installations in Africa. Nothing about the country resembles collapse. That is precisely what makes the flow across the strait so difficult to explain with simple stories. The gap is not in growth, it is in level. Morocco's GDP per capita sits near $5,000 in nominal terms and around $12,000 adjusted for purchasing power. Spain's nominal figure is above $30,000. A worker who moves from Nador to Almeria does not become more productive overnight. She becomes more valuable overnight, because the price of an hour of her labor is set by the economy she stands in, rather than the skill she carries. 14 kilometers of water functions as one of the sharpest single-step wage boundaries on the planet. Then there is who feels it. Youth unemployment in Morocco ran near 22% in 2025 by World Bank estimates. Female labor force participation sits at roughly 19%, meaning 4 out of 5 Moroccan women of working age are outside the measured economy entirely. Those two numbers describe one population: young, educated enough to read a job listing, and locked out of the formal market at home.
The money that already crosses proves the logic works. Moroccans abroad sent home more than $12.4 billion in 2025, according to the country's exchange office. That is roughly 7.5% of national GDP, and it makes Morocco the second largest remittance recipient in the Middle East and North Africa after Egypt. Every household with a cousin in Spain has direct evidence of the return on the crossing. Remittances are not an abstraction in a balance of payments table. They are a school fee in Beni Mellal, a roof in Tétouan, a wedding in Nador. They are also the single most persuasive recruitment message any smuggler could ever write, delivered by trusted family members rather than criminals. But the 14 kilometers only became a frontier at all because of 2 cities that were never supposed to still exist. Ceuta came under Portuguese control in 1415 and passed to Spain in 1580, staying Spanish after Portugal regained independence in 1640. Melilla, 400 kilometers east along the same coast, has been Spanish since 1497. Both survived the decolonization of Africa intact. When France and Spain withdrew from Morocco in 1956, these 2 cities did not go with them. They remain, in legal terms, ordinary Spanish municipalities that happen to sit on the African continent. The consequence is that the European Union has a land border with Africa in 2 places and nowhere else. Everything that follows from that is structural. A person who steps onto Ceuta's pavement is standing in Spain, inside the EU, subject to Spanish administrative law and European human rights obligations. There is no transit zone, no international waters, no ambiguity of jurisdiction. The map does the legal work that 1,000 kilometers of Mediterranean does everywhere else. Spain has spent 3 decades trying to engineer that ambiguity back into existence. The enclaves are ringed by multimeter fences, motion sensors, thermal cameras, and a permanent deployment of the Civil Guard and National Police, integrated into a coastal surveillance system that also watches the strait itself. Both cities are outside the EU Customs Union and outside Schengen's free movement area, which produces the strange result that a Spanish city is checked on entry to mainland Spain. Ceuta holds roughly 84,000 residents on about 18 square kilometers. Melilla holds slightly more people on 12. Morocco has never accepted the arrangement. Rabat considers both cities occupied territory and has raised the question repeatedly at the United Nations. It also draws the comparison Spain refuses to draw with Gibraltar, the British territory on Spain's own southern tip. Madrid's position is that the enclaves predate the modern Moroccan state. The dispute has never escalated to force, and it has never been resolved. It is instead managed through the traffic that passes between them, which is why control of that traffic carries weight far beyond migration policy. An unresolved sovereignty claim wrapped around the EU's only African land border, held by a country that also controls whether anyone reaches that border, is not a diplomatic footnote. It is leverage with a permanent address. And the first place to see how that leverage operates is in a small Moroccan town that used to make its living off the fence. For decades, the border at Tarajal ran on a legal fiction. Goods entered Ceuta duty-free by sea, then left on the backs of people. A person carrying merchandise counts as personal baggage, not commercial import. So tens of thousands of Moroccans crossed each morning, strapped bales of textiles, blankets, and food to their bodies, and walked back through the checkpoint. Almost all were women. They were called porteadoras. Nothing was taxed, nothing was declared. A bale could weigh more than the woman carrying it. Payment was a few euros per trip, and most made several trips a day. The scale was not marginal. Estimates cited by Moroccan analysts put the value of goods moving through Ceuta and Melilla this way, at well over €1 billion a year. Revenue that never touched the Moroccan treasury. Crushes at the crossing gates injured and killed porters repeatedly. In October 2019, Moroccan authorities closed the commercial crossing at Tarajal too and ended the trade. The reporting at the time described the closure as affecting Finidec's population of roughly 78,000 and the wider Tétouan region. What happened next is the part that matters. An informal economy supporting an entire province was switched off in a single administrative decision, and no formal economy appeared to replace it. Rabat announced an industrial and logistics zone at Finidec, fed by wholesale cargo from Tanger to absorb the displaced workers. Construction began. Employment at the scale the smuggling trade had provided did not. Morocco had a sound fiscal reason to close the trade. The treasury was losing revenue on every bale. The reasoning was fiscal. The effect landed on a labor market.
Finidec is also, by geographic coincidence, the town where the 5-kilometer swim to Ceuta begins. A place that had spent 30 years earning its income from the proximity of a European city was left with the proximity and nothing else. When crowds gathered at that shoreline in 2021 and again in 2026, they were not gathering at a random point on the coast. They were gathering where the work used to be. This is the recurring mechanism in this story. A control measure produces a second-order effect nobody scores, and the effect shows up years later as pressure somewhere else on the same border. The commercial crossing closed a source of income. Something much larger was closing sources of income across the whole country at the same time. In early 2026, Morocco declared the end of a drought that had lasted 7 consecutive years. It was, by most measurements, the worst dry period in 4 decades. Heavy winter rain had refilled reservoirs that reached historic lows. The Almasira Dam, one of the country's largest, fell to near 1% of capacity at the start of 2024. Agriculture absorbed the damage. Cereal production nearly halved across the drought years, pushing Morocco into heavier dependence on wheat imports from Europe and the United States to keep subsidized bread affordable. National livestock herds shrank by 38% against the previous census, taken 9 years earlier. During the worst of it, irrigation dams serving the Dukola and Sus Massa farming regions stood at 2% and 15% full, because the state prioritized drinking water for cities over water for fields. Agriculture still employs close to a third of Morocco's workforce, which makes a bad harvest a national employment event rather than a sectoral one. The employment figure is the one that connects to the Strait. Since 2019, Morocco's agricultural sector has lost roughly 720,000 net jobs. Those jobs were not distributed evenly. They were concentrated among rural households with limited savings, limited formal qualifications, and few options other than movement. The first move is almost always internal, to Casablanca, to Tangier, to the coastal cities. That is where the second decision gets made. A family that has already relocated once, that has already broken its attachment to a village and a plot of land, faces a very different calculation about relocating again. The hardest step in migration is usually the first one, and drought took that step on behalf of hundreds of thousands of people. The Strait then presents itself as a marginal extension of a journey already underway. Water tables do not recover on the same schedule as rainfall. Morocco is now building desalination capacity intended to supply more than half the country's drinking water by 2030, an admission that the underlying scarcity outlasts any single wet winter. Researchers tracking the region describe drought cycles recurring every 5 to 6 years, which means the 7-year event was a severity outlier rather than a one-off. The rural population that moved during it has not moved back. What that population encounters at the coast is an industry that has learned to price it. Spanish police have dismantled Moroccan networks that ferried people across the strait on high-powered jet skis. The trip took roughly 30 minutes. The price was €4,000 per person, with 1 to 3 passengers and a pilot on each machine, covering less than 15 kilometers of water. For that money, a person could fly from Casablanca to Madrid roughly 40 times, if a visa existed, which, for most applicants, it does not. That price gap is the entire business model. Smuggling networks do not sell transport. They sell access to a legal status that cannot be purchased through any official channel, and they price it against the wage differential waiting on the other side. A €4,000 fee is recoverable within a year of Spanish agricultural work. The customer is not irrational. The customer is running a discounted cash flow calculation with their own life as the risk premium. The product line stratifies like any other market. At the top sit jet skis and fast, semi-rigid craft, the same hulls used to run hashish north across the strait, offering speed and a real chance of evading radar. In the middle sit wooden boats and inflatable dinghies, cheaper and slower. At the bottom sits the option that costs almost nothing: an inner tube, a wetsuit if you can find one, and the 5-kilometer shoreline swim to Ceuta. Enforcement pressure pushes buyers down that ladder, not out of the market. The routes respond to enforcement like water finding a level. As surveillance tightened in the strait, departures shifted south to the Atlantic and the long crossing to the Canary Islands. Hundreds of kilometers of open ocean, rather than 14 in a channel. Frontex recorded just over 16,800 detections on the Western African route in 2025, a fall of roughly 60%, driven by tighter controls in Mauritania, Morocco, and Senegal. Over the same year, the Western Mediterranean route rose 15%, with Algeria accounting for more than 70% of arrivals on that corridor. Across all EU external borders, Frontex counted about 178,000 irregular crossings in 2025, down 26%, the lowest since 2021. Enforcement moved the flow. It did not remove it. Every displacement of a route is measured in headlines as a policy success. It is also measured by a small Spanish organization that has been counting since 2007 in a completely different unit. Caminando Fronteras is a Spanish NGO that compiles deaths and disappearances on the migration routes to Spain. Its method matters because it explains why its numbers diverge from official ones. The organization runs a phone line that receives distress calls from boats in real time, then cross-references those calls with family reports and survivor testimony to reconstruct vessels that were never found. Its 2024 figure was 10,457 people dead or missing. Its 2025 figure was 3,090, counted between January 1st and December 15th, including 192 women and 437 children. The organization attributes the fall to a collapse in departures rather than to any improvement in safety at sea. Those two numbers sit beside a third. Spain's Interior Ministry recorded 35,935 irregular entries in 2025, a fall of about 40% year-on-year. Arrivals dropped sharply, and deaths dropped roughly in proportion. The share of people who set out and did not arrive did not improve. The route simply carried fewer people. The route breakdown shows where the risk concentrated. The Atlantic crossing to the Canary Islands accounted for 1,906 of the 2025 deaths, down from 9,757 the year before. A newer corridor running from Algeria to the Balearic Islands accounted for 1,037, up from 517 in 2024. Pressure applied at one departure point reappears as a longer, colder, less monitored crossing somewhere else along the same coastline. This is the accounting problem that runs through every migration policy debate in Europe. Arrivals are counted precisely, published monthly and cited in parliaments. Deaths at sea are estimated by NGOs from incomplete data, disputed by governments, and rarely attached to the enforcement decision that redirected the route. The two figures are produced by different institutions with different incentives, and they are almost never presented on the same page. The International Organization for Migration runs a separate global count and consistently publishes lower totals than Caminando Fronteras because it requires a higher evidentiary threshold before recording a death. Neither organization claims its figure is complete. A boat that leaves the Moroccan coast and is never reported missing by anyone produces no entry in any database. Where the two do meet on the same page, the record is uncomfortable. Twice in the last 12 years, deaths occurred not in open water, but at the fence itself, in front of officers of both states, with video. Those two cases show what the system does when the evidence cannot be estimated away. On February 6, 2014, roughly 400 people attempted to swim around the Tarajal breakwater into Ceuta. Spain's civil guard responded with tear gas, rubber bullets, and batons fired toward the water. 14 people died. The Spanish Interior Ministry initially denied that riot control material had been used, then acknowledged it days later after footage circulated. The legal history that followed is the substantive part. 16 civil guard officers were placed under investigation. A Ceuta judge closed the case in January 2018, citing insufficient evidence to prosecute. Courts reopened and refiled the investigation multiple times across 6 years on differing grounds, and the process drew documented objections, including the refusal to allow victims' relatives to participate as parties in the proceedings. Amnesty International described the response as showing disregard for human life. The incident also gave a name to a practice. Spain had, for years, conducted immediate returns at the enclaves, handing people back across the fence to Moroccan forces, without registration, interpreter, or asylum interview. After Tarajal, the Spanish parliament amended the public security law in 2015 to create a specific legal category for these returns at Ceuta and Melilla, converting an informal practice into a codified one. That codification is what makes the case load-bearing, rather than merely tragic. A contested border practice was tested by a mass casualty event, survived judicial scrutiny, and emerged with statutory backing. The European Court of Human Rights then examined the practice in a separate case brought by 2 men returned immediately after climbing the Melilla fence with around 70 others in August 2014. A chamber of the court found in their favor in 2017. On February 13, 2020, the Grand Chamber reversed it unanimously. Spain had not carried out a prohibited collective expulsion, the court held, because the applicants crossed in a large group outside an authorized point. Its reasoning turned on whether genuine and effective legal routes into Spanish territory existed. 10 years later, one survivor, who was a minor in 2014, filed a complaint against Spain with the United Nations Committee Against Torture. No officer has been convicted in connection with the 14 deaths. The second case, 8 years later and 400 kilometers east, produced an even wider gap between what was recorded and what was resolved. On June 24, 2022, around 2,000 people, largely Sudanese and other sub-Saharan nationals, moved on the Melilla border fence in the early hours of the morning. Many had spent months in makeshift camps in the forests above Nador, subject to periodic clearance operations by Moroccan forces. Spain's asylum office in Melilla had been functionally inaccessible to sub-Saharan applicants for years, because reaching the window required first passing a Moroccan checkpoint. Moroccan and Spanish security forces responded at the fence. A crowd crush developed in the narrow approach to the crossing point. Human Rights Watch recorded the outcome as at least 23 dead. The death toll has never been reconciled. The Moroccan government's figure is 23. United Nations experts estimated at least 37. The Moroccan Association for Human Rights in Nador put 77 people still unaccounted for. Bodies were buried in Nador without identification in several documented cases, and families in Sudan have spent years attempting to establish whether relatives are dead or detained. Accountability closed quickly on both sides. Within days of the events, before autopsies were completed, the Prosecutor General of the Nador Court of Appeals told Morocco's National Human Rights Council that Moroccan forces had not used excessive force. Spain's Public Prosecutor's Office closed its own 6-month investigation in December 2022, exonerating Spanish forces and calling only for disciplinary review of civil guard agents who threw rocks. Border Forensics, a research group that reconstructs border incidents from open-source video and spatial modeling, later published an analysis of the site itself. Its finding concerned the architecture. The approach funneled a large crowd into a confined enclosure with limited exit, in a location where both states' forces were operating simultaneously. The design produced the crush independent of any individual decision made that morning. 2 states, 1 fence, between 23 and 77 people unaccounted for, and 2 investigations closed within 6 months that each located responsibility in the other jurisdiction. The gap between them is not an oversight. It is the operating characteristic of a border that two governments manage jointly and neither governs alone. Every enforcement action at that fence involves officers from both states, and every legal claim arising from it hits a jurisdictional seam. And a year before Melilla, that joint management had already been used for something other than migration. In April 2021, Spain admitted Brahim Ghali to a hospital in Logroño for COVID-19 treatment under a false identity. Ghali leads the Polisario Front, the movement seeking independence for Western Sahara from Morocco. Rabat, which claims the territory and treats the Polisario as separatist, learned of the admission and protested formally. It then recalled its ambassador to Madrid. On May 17th and 18th, 2021, roughly 8,000 people crossed into Ceuta in 2 days. Around 1,500 were minors. Most simply walked or swam around the breakwater at Tarajal, as they would again 5 years later. Spanish reporting at the time described Moroccan border personnel standing down. Morocco stated that its border resources had been strained. Spain deployed the army and returned most arrivals within days. At least one person drowned. Part of that return has since been ruled unlawful. Around 700 unaccompanied minors were sent back to Morocco in the days after the crossing. On January 22, 2024, Spain's Supreme Court held that the operation breached Spanish law, which requires an individual administrative process for every minor. It also violated the ban on collective expulsion in the European Convention on Human Rights. Government lawyers cited a 2007 bilateral agreement with Morocco covering exceptional circumstances. The court found it did not override domestic law. The diplomatic sequence that followed is documented and public. Relations remained frozen for 11 months. In March 2022, Sanchez sent a letter to King Mohammed VI describing Morocco's 2007 autonomy proposal for Western Sahara as the most serious, realistic, and credible basis for resolving the dispute. It reversed 47 years of Spanish neutrality on the territory Spain itself had colonized until 1975. Morocco returned its ambassador. The border reopened. Spain has never stated that the two events were connected as cause and effect, and Morocco has consistently denied using migration as an instrument of foreign policy. What is not in dispute is the order in which things occurred, and that the policy Spain adopted in 2022 was the specific policy Morocco had sought for 15 years. Madrid has reaffirmed it at every high-level meeting since, most recently in December 2025. Whatever the intent, the episode established a fact that every subsequent negotiation has had to price in. The party that controls departure controls the timing. And Europe, over the same period, was busy making that control considerably more valuable. The European Union committed roughly €1.5 billion to bilateral cooperation with Morocco between 2014 and 2020. It added $631 million across 2021 and 2022 under its main external funding instrument. Migration and border management run through a substantial share of it. Between 2015 and 2021, the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa committed €234 million to Morocco for anti-smuggling work and assisted returns. In 2023, the same fund allocated a further $152 million to reinforce Moroccan border management. Spain funds the relationship directly on top of that. In January 2025, Madrid allocated €2.5 million to Moroccan border surveillance, delivered as 183 motorcycles and 33 vehicles. In the first quarter of 2025, Spain committed a further $5 million for border control infrastructure. These are not aid packages in any conventional sense. They are procurement contracts for enforcement capability, deployed on foreign soil under foreign command. The policy has a name in Brussels: externalization. The logic is straightforward. A migrant intercepted on the Moroccan side of the strait never reaches EU territory, never triggers an asylum obligation, never enters a Spanish administrative process, and never appears in Frontex's detection figures. Enforcement performed before the border is cheaper, faster, and legally weightless compared to enforcement performed after it. The structural consequence is the part rarely discussed in the funding announcements. Externalization converts a neighboring state's police capacity into a service that Europe purchases and depends upon. A service that can be purchased can be repriced. A dependency runs in the direction of the party that can withhold delivery, and no quantity of transferred motorcycles changes which party that is. Morocco has also stated its willingness to accept the return of its own nationals refused entry in Europe, which is the second service with its own negotiating value. The 2026 crisis produced the same reflex within 24 hours. Von der Leyen called for smuggling networks to be dismantled and returns to be swift. France activated rapid intervention border units. The instinct across every capital was to buy more of the same capability from the same supplier. Yet the legal traffic moving in the opposite direction tells a story that none of those statements acknowledge. In 2025, roughly 25,700 Moroccan workers entered Spain legally under JECO, the state program that recruits seasonal labor directly in the country of origin. That was an increase of about 25% on the previous year. Moroccans made up around 81% of everyone hired through the scheme, and 84% of them went to a single province, Huelva, for the strawberry and berry harvest. The mechanism is deliberate. Spain's General Directorate of Migrations authorizes the quota after certifying that the domestic workforce cannot cover the harvest. Morocco's National Employment Agency, ANAPEC, pre-selects candidates and matches them to vetted employers. Historically, the scheme has favored married women with young children at home, on the reasoning that they are more likely to return. Contracts are temporary and tied to that return. For 2026, Spain's overall labor migration plan runs to roughly 164,000 positions, of which more than 88,000 are seasonal. The demographic driver is not disputed by any Spanish institution. The Bank of Spain and the United Nations have both estimated that the country needs around 300,000 migrant workers a year. Without them, the pension system and the welfare state do not survive the aging of the native population. Spain's fertility rate is among the lowest in the European Union. In November 2024, the government approved a regularization framework intended to grant residence or work permits to roughly 300,000 people annually through 2027, close to 900,000 in total. The result is already visible in the census. As of January 1st, 2025, Moroccans were the largest foreign nationality in Spain at just under 969,000 residents. Counting people born in Morocco rather than holding Moroccan passports, the figure exceeds 1,165,000. In 2025, more than 42,000 Moroccan nationals were granted Spanish citizenship, the largest single group among new citizens. So Spain publicly requires several 100,000 foreign workers a year and publicly identifies Morocco as its main source. It simultaneously operates the most militarized segment of the EU's external border against Moroccan nationals arriving without a contract. Both policies are real. Both are official. The distance between them is 14 kilometers wide, and it is not the only place these two countries move in opposite directions at once. Trade between Morocco and Spain reached a record 22.7 billion euros, making Morocco Spain's largest trading partner on the African continent. Spanish exports to Morocco alone came to nearly 13 billion euros, and Morocco absorbs 61% of everything Spain sells to Africa. Spanish investment stock in the country supports more than 27,000 direct jobs. The integration is physical as well as financial. Tanger Med, a short distance from the Spanish coast, handled 11.1 million containers and 161 million tons of cargo in 2025. It is the largest port in Africa and the Mediterranean, linked to 180 ports in 70 countries. Moroccan fruit and vegetables reach Spanish importers to the tune of roughly 900 million euros in a single year. Then there is 2030. Morocco, Spain, and Portugal will jointly host the FIFA World Cup, making Morocco the first African nation to co-host the tournament. Rabat has committed to spending on the order of $20 billion on stadiums, rail, airports, and urban infrastructure across 6 host cities. Spanish and Moroccan officials will spend the next 4 years coordinating stadium logistics, air corridors, ticketing, and the movement of hundreds of thousands of fans across the same strait. People cross too, in enormous numbers, on the right paperwork. Every summer since 1986, Spain and Morocco jointly run Operación Paso del Estrecho, the seasonal transit of the Moroccan diaspora heading home from across Europe. In 2025, it moved 3,488,208 passengers and 857,851 vehicles through Spanish ports over 3 months, a rise of nearly 3%. It is the largest recurring movement of people between Europe and Africa, and the two interior ministries coordinate it as a logistics exercise, not a crisis. Hold the two pictures side by side. Container ships, football federations, rail contracts, 22 billion euros of trade, and 3.5 million holiday passengers cross that water on a schedule. The same 14 kilometers that a lorry driver clears in a booked ferry slot is, for a young man from Fnidek without a visa, a barrier that has killed thousands of people in a decade. That is not a contradiction in the system. It is the system. A border designed to be permeable for capital, cargo, and contracts, and impermeable for labor that arrives without an employer's signature, is functioning exactly as built. Which brings the story back to July 2026 and to the specific legal document that everyone in Ceuta was arguing about. On June 29, 2026, the Administrative Litigation Chamber of Spain's Supreme Court issued Judgment 814/2026, made public on July 8th. It held that Spain's border rejection powers do not extend to people intercepted at sea while swimming toward Ceuta or Melilla. The reasoning: those people have overcome no physical barrier placed to prevent passage. Summary maritime returns, the court found, conflict with the principle of non-refoulement. The ruling does not apply to anyone entering by land, including over the fence. 3 weeks later, 60,000 people swam. Ceuta's authorities linked the surge directly to the judgment. Sanchez went further, saying Moroccan authorities had told his government that trafficking networks had taken a self-serving interpretation of the ruling and spread it, in his words, like wildfire. Migrant rights activists in Morocco publicly doubted the explanation, arguing most of those who crossed would never have heard of a Spanish administrative ruling. Sanchez said legal changes may now be needed to guarantee returns at the border. Watch what that sentence actually proposes. A court reads European and international law, finds a specific enforcement practice incompatible with it, and narrows the practice. Within 72 hours of the consequences arriving, the executive announces it will examine changing the law the court applied. Whatever one concludes about the merits, the sequence is on the public record, and it is the clearest available statement of what the border is for. Because the fence was never the mechanism. The mechanism is the answer to a single question, held simultaneously in tens of thousands of minds on the southern shore. If I get across, what happens next? Spain and Morocco have spent 3 decades and hundreds of millions of euros managing that answer. Fences, patrol vessels, transferred motorcycles, diplomatic recognition of a territorial claim, codified return procedures. In July 2026, a court adjusted the answer in a single paragraph, and 14 kilometers of water stopped working. If you want questions followed this way, the money, the documents, the mechanism rather than the noise, subscribe and tell me in the comments which border to examine next. The Strait has been called a wall for 30 years. It has never behaved like one. It behaves like a valve. Every party involved knows exactly whose hand is on it.